I wanted to start actually with you had co-written an article about the work in Cleveland.
Mm-hmm.
And, this is an example, if I'm not mistaken, of a pluralist commonwealth.
Yes, it is.
The laundry business in Cleveland. So my question here would be, what opportunity do these community co-op businesses represent in terms of economic, political, green reform? For you, is it the type of trend that's like the key cog to wide-scale reform, or is it sort of one small piece of the puzzle?
It's actually neither.
Okay.
And maybe both.
Okay.
Things like the effort in Cleveland, which is a community-wide nonprofit corporation in a neighborhood of 40,000 people with a family income of average earning income of $20,000, 20% unemployment, largely black, very poor neighborhood.
Yes.
What I think is most significant about it is it's not simply freestanding worker-owned co-ops or worker-owned companies. Its goal is to build the community. And so the co-ops are subordinated to a nonprofit corporation. And the co-ops now, there are 3 quite significant scale ones. They're not tiny little, people think of co-ops as tiny little.
Right.
Effort. So this is one of them is the largest urban greenhouse in the United States, capable of doing 3 million heads of lettuce a year, plus other herbs.
I saw that. Yeah, that's amazing.
So they're significant scale. And
hospital like promoted, or they were the ones that started it too, or?
No, the conception, I should probably lay it out a little bit more, that there are other co-ops attached to it. Another one's a large-scale, industrial-scale laundry, probably the greenest one in the Midwest. Uses very little water and very little electricity, so forth.
Yes.
And then another one of them is a solar installation company. So those are the 3 that are on the ground. They hope to have more of them. But the thing to think about is this is a complex, a community-building complex.
Yes.
It is, the second piece of it is to get the support of big nonprofit institutions like hospitals and universities. The term that we use is anchor institutions. They're usually anchored. They can't go any place. And they don't have a lot of public money, Medicare, Medicaid, hospital money, education money, a lot of public dollars. So the notion of using that money in part to support contracts with these worker-owned community building co-ops.
Yes.
And that's the idea of this particular strategy.
Great.
I think there's another aspect to it, which I know there's an ethical and philosophical issue in the conference as well, and that's where I start. The notion of how you build a culture of community, of mutual responsibility, of ethical responsibility,
yes,
for me is critical in all this. So and I'm a supporter of small worker co-ops, but so far we've only been they're very hard to develop. There are 400 or 500 in the country, and they're extremely difficult to develop on their own.
Mm-hmm.
But worker-owned ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, there are more of them.
Okay.
But they typically don't include this cultural aspect. They're kind of guys who are working in it. They're good guys. They're like in any other company, except they have a share of ownership.
Yes.
But they're not primarily oriented to building the community.
Okay. Yes.
It's a private business, but it's owned by the workers. Now that's certainly a step up.
Right.
But what's interesting about the complex, and I know that the people who are concerned with ecological issues, how do you get a community-wide concern, which includes not only economic, but ecological and other concerns that are of the whole community? So for instance, a private business, if it's in competition with others, must pollute unless the other people don't, because it will increase his costs compared with the other people. Mm-hmm. So if you get everybody not to pollute, then there's no problem. But if one of them is polluting and the other one isn't, they're going to lose out in the market. So they're forced. They may have the best intention, but they're forced to do this.
Right.
How do you build a culture which doesn't do that, and institutions which the economic term is internalize the externality, so that the whole community can decide when it owns the businesses to pollute itself.
Yes.
So it's a rational internal community choice. And obviously, usually they don't. So these kinds of structures, and I'm concerned to begin to give focus to this because it's been neglected, the implications in terms of building community culture and an ethical society, why some issues and why some institutions have more power and more implications than others.
Right.
Now, let me just say footnote that small-scale co-ops usually are subordinated to the culture of the community. So community culture as a whole can actually handle this problem because the small-scale co-ops and the people within them often feel, well, we're part of the community, we're not going to pollute the community.
Right.
But if you go beyond small scale, market conditions begin to force people to do things that they might not otherwise want to do. So structure and design is really important in system change.
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I was going to save this question for later, but I suppose I'll ask it now. In terms of, bringing, I know how it's not, the vision isn't to have piecemeal reform, but instead to have entirely new system. And what do you see in terms of implementing? Do you see that being more in terms of like a new leader that has these values, or in terms of like a whole bunch of people chipping away at it gradually, or a revolution, or how do you envision that new system taking root?
Well, the term I use is evolutionary reconstruction, and it's a carefully chosen term. Reform, which is what we think about mostly, is the big corporations and the business community drive the economy, mm-hmm. and then we try to regulate them or pass laws to help out for the poor. The income distribution that they generate is highly unequal, so we try to correct after the fact, mm-hmm. Or we try to deal with environmental issues after the fact.
Right.
But the system itself produces inequality, excessive growth, pollution. That's how the system is designed.
Right.
Reform is to correct it. I used to work in the House and the Senate. I worked for Gaylord Nelson, the founder of Earth Day. And all of the legislation is to try to regulate. Now, revolution, on the other hand, is to overthrow these guys.
Yeah.
Take it over. And we know in many cases where that leads, at least in modern history, that it's led to the power to do that requires very strong power, often dictatorial power, or at least strong states. And that's a direction, and in ecological concerns, what we know is not very good from the past experience. Now, the Soviet Union was an underdeveloped country, there was war and so forth, but still, the design is not very good for these concerns. So revolution and reform are not particularly good designs, but that's the traditional option. The term evolutionary reconstruction involves rebuilding institutions like the one in Cleveland from the bottom up, but also doing politics to further that and to get support for it. So, for instance, we drafted a model legislation. What would happen if we, at the national level, began to put significant funding into developing these kinds of institutions? That's only one model, but that's one way of thinking about it. If you build out institutions, building from the ground, walking on two legs is the term I like. Yeah. Building from the bottom, but also politics in support of building from the bottom at the state level, at the city level, at the national level. There are lots of things you can do to help. For instance, city government buys a lot of things, and it can use its buying power to build these kinds of institutions or support them. Yeah. State government as well. So it's a process both of institution change, but also using politics. And I think more important, and I know there's a great deal of ethical concern in this particular conference, beginning to generate, and it hasn't been happening, and I think it's very important to inject a serious ethical concern, a moral concern, not simply in we ought to do X or we ought to do Y or it's good to do X. Yes, of course. Yes. But do the institutions we're talking about nurture the values that we want as outcomes? And that's a very tough question because usually we don't ask that question. Do they inherently? Right. Or are we trying to paste values on top of institutions that actually are producing other values? Right. So I think that's a critical issue, and it forces you to look at design much more carefully than usual and the processes of building much more carefully than usual. Yes. Okay, that's great. So this would be a good lead into this next question, which, I watched the Pluralist Commonwealth video, and I noticed how when you're talking about community co-ops, and there's sort of this exchange of
economic exchange at this very grassroots, localized level. And then eventually you have like communities upon communities, and these communities will reach out to a larger scale economic enterprise. I'm just curious about, I think I understand how the communities would work. Could you give me articulate a little bit more of a vision in terms of how it goes from those co-op communities to larger economic exchange?
Yeah, that's a very critical question, because there's a whole literature. Some of it came out of anarchism, some of it came out of community development, practical development, that says really the community is the only thing, and stay at the community level. Well, that's very short-sighted. So communities, for instance, if I were able to come for the conference, unfortunately I can't, I'd have to fly in an airplane.
Yes.
So communities don't build airplanes, and they certainly don't build the satellites upon which your cell phone is based.
Yeah.
So what do you do about big things?
Yeah.
And obviously you need something bigger than a community usually.
Yeah.
So the question of how communities relate to each other is essentially a planning question. And what is the structure? Now, the United States is so big. It's 320 million, 30 million people in a continent of almost 3,000 miles, that it's almost impossible to imagine participatory democracy in a planning system of 330 million people.
Right.
At probably regional scale, people don't realize how big the country is. Germany can fit in the state of Montana. The European countries are tiny compared with this mammoth.
Yeah.
So a planning system begins to look at what are the larger things that are needed. As a question of democracy, how do we allocate capital? How do we allocate purchasing from different communities? How do we use that power to stabilize the economics of communities? Those are planning questions above communities, but you can plan for growth, which is what most of the planning has been in corporate in capitalist systems and in state socialist systems. Or you can plan for stability and ecological sustainability and equality.
Yes.
So those are the kinds of large order questions. But again, notice carefully, the design of the planning system inevitably reflects, one, the values of the communities. That's in the democracy, and the power structure of how the communities are organized.
Yes.
So to build a different system, and that's what this is all about,
right,
requires both building values and institutions that ultimately generate the guidance for regional or national planning. You can't get democratic planning that will produce outcomes better than whatever the community culture is that produces values and priorities and the kind of people who are going to vote.
Yes.
So it all depends on building from the bottom up, but ultimately you do need to go larger scale for bigger industry and for coordinated planning.
Yes. And I'm from the county, Snohomish County, where Boeing plant is. And so it's one of the biggest buildings in the world. And so, it's a very apropos metaphor that you cited there. For example, and I agree with you that, in terms of the community's values, that if it starts there, if there's let's say one of these businesses, let's take the laundry company in Cleveland. If that were all of a sudden to start wildly prospering, because the values are at a communal level and the ethics are there, they're not gonna be desiring profit that becomes unjust, right? Is that kind of the model, or is there any in there, or?
Well, that's a very good question, because we don't. The hope is, and first, that the laundry in Cleveland is the greenest laundry you've ever seen. It uses less water, less heat. It's in a LEED, I think platinum, LEED building. It's all of it's designed that way.
That is so awesome.
There's no doubt that they can get out of, we hope that it will stay with the values it started with.
Right.
Usually what drives them either is real hunger for profits or competition. Somebody cutting costs, and then they say we got to cut costs. So that's why the hospitals and universities and the whole politics and culture are really important, because they could be undercut. So we're hoping that the design and the politics and the culture can sustain the values in this way of building. But it's certainly open to question. We'll see how it goes.
Okay.
So far it's going well.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Okay, that's fantastic. Let me see another thing I was going to do. I wanted to ask you about, since we're still talking about Commonwealth projects, participatory budgeting. What are the strengths and shortcomings of a model like participatory budgeting?
Well, we've had a lot of experience with participatory budgeting, but it's an important stepping stone towards real planning. Participatory budgeting really involves giving citizens who show up at a meeting,
right?
Who show up at a meeting, that's how that works.
Yeah.
The right to control certain quite small decisions so far.
Okay. Yeah.
But it gives you a sense of participation in choice.
Yes.
Democratic planning would mean that for instance, city budget was open to genuine democracy of the community, like ancient Athens, as long as you weren't a slave,
yeah,
where everybody gets to vote. That would be a much broader, and much more powerful form of participatory planning. Yeah. I think the way to think about participatory budgeting is a stepping stone towards an idea about participatory planning that we're going to have to do a lot of experimentation with.
Okay. Yeah, because to me, it kind of brings up this question between a republic versus democracy, and, the value of having elected leaders who are specialized in, let's say, economics or business. And so like at a community level, maybe what everyone votes for isn't necessarily the wisest course of action. Wouldn't that be kind of a snag? Or?
Well, it depends how deep the educational process is. There have been a number of researchers, political scientists, who've experimented with taking randomly chosen citizens and with certain very complex issues, but actually giving them a lot of information.
Yes.
About the issues and the implications.
Yes.
And the choices become much more informed. So a genuinely serious planning, and particularly, when you get to very large scale, the issues are complex, and almost certainly you're going to be delegating. You can't, tell me exactly what it means to have participatory democracy in a system of 330 million people, 3,000 miles corner to corner. It's very, very vague rhetoric. So clearly there's going to be some delegation of some kind.
Yes.
Working that out in a much more democratic form than the current system. The current system in the United States, it's in some ways the absurdity of it is, we've lived with it for so long. The absurdity of a state like California with almost 35 million people having 2 senators, and the state of Wyoming with less than 1,600,000, I think it is, 2 senators. There is something minimally, as marginally, you could say, undemocratic, the number of the votes per person. And the Senate's capacity to stop things. Our Constitution, though I wouldn't put this on the first step forward, but our Constitution is clearly not a very democratic Constitution. It's a very much in need of reform. But I wouldn't put it first thing to do, because there are a lot of people, the reform direction they'd probably take it. Given the current power structure, it would be a direction I don't think I'd like.
Okay, yes. Well, and it sounds like I hear in this answer as well that the average Joe is less dumb than we think, or you have this sort of optimism that if they're given the right kind of system and shown values, that people will be able to make these decisions better than let's say someone who would otherwise be cynical about the average Joe's ability to make these kind of decisions, I guess, put it that way.
Well, the average Joe and Jane, let's put it. Would under the current relationships, people are in such terrible pressure. Unemployment or underemployment, and fear and anger, and so that there are good reasons to see with this Trump phenomenon is not about Trump. It's certainly he would make it about. But there's a lot of pain out there, and people are angry, and the system isn't producing for them. So I don't particularly like the direction it's taken, but there is something wrong.
Yes.
So what happens if you have a community in a system in which people are beginning to get equitable treatment, stability of jobs, job guarantees, which society certainly could do, a sense of community support, decent all the things that this rich society could give. We might see the average Joe and Jane doing different things than getting really angry.
Yes.
One way to think about it is the current system produces the equivalent of something like $240,000 for every family of 4 currently. Currently.
Yeah.
That's a very rich system, which could make for the lives of everybody, the average Jane and Joe, very, very different from the way we now see it, where the top 400 people have more wealth than the bottom 180 million.
Right.
It's highly unequal, and the anger and irrationality produced by unemployment and inequality distort people's feelings in a powerful way. It isn't just Donald Trump. It's that there's a lot of unfairness and pain out there that he's playing on.
Yes.
That a very rich system could easily. I mean, let me put it a different way. Currently, the system could produce $120,000 per family of 4 in a 20-hour week already. And the technology that we know is growing so fast, if we did only as well as the 20th century technology, which had a 7-fold increase over the century, we're talking about 1 million or more per family of 4, or 500,000 a 20-hour week and 250,000 a 10-hour week, if it were distributed properly. The system is extremely productive, and the contradictions morally and technologically and politically are huge.
Right.
And that's, I think, opening up the pain and the irrationality, because people are very, very upset.
Yes, that's totally fair. Okay, so I have a question for you about.
Let me say that they should be upset at this situation. It's really inequitable.
Right.
So that it's understandable. We don't necessarily support the direction that the irrationality is going, but being angry and upset is a human response to what's happening.
Right. Right. So I wanted to ask you a question about toward ecological civilization. So how could or should toward EcoCiv engage emerging social movements to reform politics? For instance, Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, DM25, Podemos, Syriza, pirate parties. Not that you have to touch on all of these, just maybe a couple if you wanted to.
Well, I think it's, I think we can support the best of them politically and morally. So merely giving support to the better things going on is a really good, important first step. And that's what Bernie's demonstrated.
Yeah.
I think to go beyond that, and this is really a very severe demand requirement, you have to know what you're talking about. You have to think through why what you propose is a good idea. And that gets us beyond projects. It gets us to, what are you talking about? And why should Corbyn, or why should they listen to you other than for moral reasons, unless the homework has been done, including taking on some of the more radical questions. And I think often people are hesitant to ask some of the tougher questions, and they kind of hope small business will solve the problem, which we know is a very weak position when we look at the problem of the large corporation in all these systems. So I think self-criticism intellectually of the models we are addressing is really important. With the Next System project, which we've been putting forward and developing, is an attempt to get much more sophisticated dialogue amongst proponents of different systemic designs, so that we get tougher on ourselves rather than saying, we have the answer and you should do that. Well, let's look at our answers a little bit more closely and see if they make as much sense as we think they do. And I'm thinking, when I've done it, many of us, including myself, there's a lot more work to do to say we have a better answer. We have a good direction. Maybe we have a moral direction we'd like to urge. Yeah. But a systemic design is not the same as a moral direction. That is, what is the design that will produce the outcomes institutionally, and how do we get there? That's a much more demanding task. And I know that ecological civilization is oriented to that. But if I had one thing to say, is let's get tougher on ourselves about design and really force a serious discussion about the implications of different designs, rather than whatever happens and I know that's an exaggeration, but I think it's time for a real debate about design and its implications.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, another one. Yeah, so I don't know exactly how to frame this question, so forgive me if it's it seems like the pluralist, like something like pluralist commonwealth presupposes intelligent and caring individuals, on the one hand, in some sense. And I think on another level, I just wonder about these types out there that are definitely, there's many of them that are, sort of the greedy, selfish entrepreneur type, or anti-government, antisocial. How would they, if our economy and our nation were to have this totally different system, how would they fit in? What is the model for inclusivity of these types of people? Or, what would they pose a threat, or how do you see that?
Well, I'm a historian as well as a political economist.
Okay.
And I don't see history I don't see that question as a snapshot.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
And I, beginning at any point where we are, the question, and this is another system design question, whether they actually have thought through the pathways to reconstructing institutions that begin to give people enough security and enough support so that they begin to allow for different values to come forward.
Right.
So it's not like, oh, people are this or people are that. Look at when my mother was a young woman.
Yeah.
There was no feminist movement.
Yeah.
It just wasn't there. And the opportunities that existed for her to think about were extremely limited. That isn't true today. So the people you call a woman and the thoughts a woman has, and this is true for men, it's true for different cultures, it's true for any person in any spectrum, is different than the person 50 years ago or 70 years ago in the same situation. Right. So the notion of evolving or evolutionary reconstruction is not simply economic, but how the values and the economy evolve together becomes one of the design questions.
Yeah.
And you can't be saying, oh, here the people are good or bad or nasty. It's whether or not we're actually thinking about things that way. And I'm trying to suggest a way of thinking about the evolving trajectory of change rather than X, Y, Z is what we want tomorrow, which I think is a very different question.
Yes.
And it also intersects with these technological questions. We could be easily at a 10-hour week very shortly. Now provides stability of community, stability of jobs, and equity, which can be done in a very rich society, then it opens up the possibility of flowering a very different culture, very different individual attitudes if there is security. So the question is not static. It's an evolving question from my perspective, and then it puts the ball right in the heart of the field for people like us who think about design and change. Yes. And indeed, I would say we haven't been tough enough with ourselves about this. I think we've kind of ducked many of these questions, and I would I hope this conference, and I think this conference it will begin to address this much more powerfully.
Great. Yes. If I could have a little follow-up to this question, engaging communities is it's a mindset that is, sometimes I think it requires, I think when the dominant culture is not doing this, it's not so hard to do it. But if it's not, it's like kind of in a capitalistic society, you have to kind of set a new lifestyle to do these things. And it seems like there's lots of personality types that are non-participatory in that. And this is kind of like, maybe getting at the same question, which, I don't mean to do that. I'm just trying to frame it a little bit just to hear what you'd say. Do you think that these people, do you see in the future that yes, the values will intrinsically change, but they'll still be like outlier individuals that are sort of still going by their own mode? And does that pose any obstacle? Or?
Well, I think the period we're in, say the next 3 decades, is potentially the period not of resolving all of this, but of laying foundations for a resolution. I don't think we'll get to the promised land in 3 decades.
Right.
But I think we can lay conditions down in different parts if we do our work well, and if we're lucky, and we may be able to lay down institutional experiments, developments, politics, culture. The role of the churches is very important, and they've been backed away from a lot of this. They're very interested in poverty, some of them. but really taking on the system question rather than little issues on the side is on the table. And most of the churches have, they're kind of on the edge of this and haven't engaged very seriously. I worked with the Catholic bishops, in 1985 when they put out a pastoral, which was very, very serious pastoral on the economy. They haven't done much since the new Pope has. The new Pope is raising systemic questions. And he's talking about the same issues you and I are talking about now in a very radical way, but also with a very powerful moral critique and a cultural critique. So it's time for the for the churches as well to get into this game. But it's everybody. It's everybody on the field now. We need all hands on deck.
Absolutely, yeah, I fully agree with that. That's fair. It's just it seems like people like to be selfish, and it's not something they're going to renounce very easily. Just the mode of being selfish, of thinking, rather than cooperatively.
Yeah, I think that's true, but it's also different conditions.
Yeah.
Make for different selfishness. If you're very insecure about your income for next year, you've got to take care of business. You've got the family to worry about. If you've got a guaranteed income and a guaranteed job and the guaranteed health care and all the things that a rich society can provide, instead of giving it all to the top, you can be a little bit more relaxed.
Yes, so that's awesome.
It's like psychology is not psychology sometimes is rigid, but it's also very dependent on conditions of a lot of people.
Yes.
Have to be what they are.
Yes, that's well said. Yeah, I agree with you. That's great. Okay, let me scour and see if I have another one, because I kind of got out of order here. Let's see. There might just be maybe just one more question.
Okay, good. I think I'm giving my lecture.
Right. We can play this tape maybe. Okay, so I guess I would like to the final question to be this, if I may. It seems odd to ask this to someone who endorses collaborative thought in such a way. But what do you suppose in particular makes your vision unique in comparison to like-minded peers?
I think I've tried to integrate, starting at the community level, the structural change in support of institutions of community. A lot of people talk about community in peer groups. Very rarely is there structural support for community, and what that might mean. Like we talked about the Cleveland model, which is a primitive model. We need to go much beyond it. But it has a structural principle of nurturing the notion of we're all in it. We're all in it together. Not many people. There are some wonderful theorists of the culture of community and theorists of the philosophy of community. Really nice work has been done in that area. But there's a bridge problem to getting down to the nature of the institutions that actually could sustain and nurture the value and culture of community. Right. So that's one thing. I think that the second piece is not many people have taken on the very large economic institutions. That is, they say we regulate them or break them up is the typical position. Right. We should regulate.
Right.
And I think that we're going to have to face what used to be called socialist questions. Large corporations must grow. They can't raise capital unless they grow. They can't go to Wall Street.
Right.
And we live in an era ecologically where we need to challenge growth. The nature of that institution is in conflict with a very important ecological principle.
Yes.
Which means for large industry, at some point, some of those will have to become public utilities. And most people have shied away from that because they're frightened of the socialist language, and there's a lot of bureaucracy that's been associated with institutions, and many of them haven't been ecologically sound. But the principle at work is got to be dealt with. And then reform those institutions in ways that we build the culture that can do the reform. Right. So and the third one, there's a lot of other ones, but you asked me. The third area is I think the country is too big to manage. So I think we are inevitably, you tell me, as I said earlier, you tell me how we do participatory democracy in a 3,000-mile country of 330 million people, soon to be 400 million. So there's a problem of scale. And during the 1930s, there was a very sophisticated discussion of presidents of the Political Science Association at that level of how we begin to think about regionalizing, changing the authority to a regional level to begin to deal with scale. I mean, a state like California is with the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world.
Right.
It could be a semi-autonomous, semi-self-governing region within a confederation of some scale.
Right.
So we haven't dealt with that even intellectually, let alone politically. So I would urge those are the biggies.
Right.
One more, and then which is most of the model builders have not dealt with the problem of individual liberty. What are the institutional requirements of liberty? And what does it mean how do you build freedom? And part of it's time, allocating free time. Part of it is absolute job security. The only people who have absolute liberty are college professors with tenure. They cannot be fired no matter what they say.
Uh-huh.
Now, it's not always true, but by and large,
yeah,
that's an institutional support of liberty. If that were true for every citizen, they would be free to speak their minds. So, but there's a whole range of other things like that. The issue of liberty, I've been emphasizing community, but I don't think community works at all unless you have institutions of liberty to counterbalance it. And that's a design question. So I would put those on the table and say, time to debate, time to get serious. What are we doing in these areas? And get sophisticated about the dialogue and correct each other and have a real interchange on this level.